I have done plenty of live streams on Vertical, but I've never done live on Shorts before. So I thought I would give it a try. And so that I have something to do as I'm testing this out, I am going to read a book that is no longer under copyright infringement, well, a story from it, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which I have actually not read before. I've read adaptations of it. I've seen adaptations of it. I don't know if anybody's going to show up, but I wanted to kind of test out going live in this format. I recently did a thing where I read aloud the first chapters of some books and gave commentary on them, which was fun, and people seemed to like that. So I thought, you know what? Let's try doing some reading, because why the hell not? So I'm going to give it a minute before I get started. I don't think it's a very long story. Will I read the whole thing? I don't know. Okay, maybe it's longer than I think it is, but we're at least going to read some of it. And oh, okay. No, it is pretty long. We will not read all of it. We'll read a little bit of it. Hello. Welcome. So I've never done live on Vertical before, but I was saying, because it's not under copyright anymore, I thought it would be fun to do a little reading from The Turn of the Screw, which is on my list of classics to read. So I'm gonna read part of it. This is quite a long story, so maybe I'll read a few pages if anybody is interested. I'm supposed to read this whole book at some point this year. All right. The story had held us round the fire sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. That is a very long sentence. What? Oh boy. This will be very interesting. The case, I may mention, was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had gathered us for the occasion. Yeah, you know what? I didn't know it was set during Christmas either. Hello. So this is interesting. Okay. So the case I may mention was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had gathered us for the occasion, an appearance of a dreadful kind, to a little boy sleeping in the room with his mother, and waking her up in the terror of it, waking her not to dissipate his dread and soothe him to sleep again, but to encounter also herself, before she had succeeded in doing so, the same sight that had shocked him. It was this observation that drew from Douglas, not immediately, but later in the evening, a reply that had the interesting consequence to which I call attention. Someone else told a story not particularly effective, which I saw he was not following. This I took for a sign that he had himself something to produce, and that we should only have to wait. We waited, in fact, till 2 nights later, but that same evening, before we scattered, he brought out what was in his mind. I quite agree, in regard to Griffin's ghost, or whatever it was, that its appearing first to the little boy at so tender an age adds a particular touch, but it's not the first occurrence of its charming kind that I know to have been concerned with a child. If the child gives the effect another turn of the screw, what do you say to 2 children? We say, of course, somebody exclaimed, the 2 children give 2 turns. Also, that we want to hear about them. So we have the turn of the screw phrase in the first page of the story, which is interesting. I've seen adaptations of this, but I've never read the original before. I can see Douglas there before the fire, to which he had got up to present his back, looking down at this converser with his hands in his pockets. Nobody but me till now has ever heard. It's quite too horrible. This was naturally declared by several voices to give the thing the utmost price, and our friend, with quiet art, prepared his triumph by turning his eyes over the rest of us and going on. It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it. For sheer terror? I remember asking. He seemed to say it wasn't so simple as that. to be really at a loss as how to qualify it. He passed his hand over his eyes, made a little wincing grimace, for dreadfulness. "Oh, how delicious!" cried one of the women. He took no notice of her. He looked at me, but as if, instead of me, he saw what he spoke of, for general uncanny ugliness, and horror, and pain. "Well then," I said, "just sit right down and begin." So I think this is coming from, I know there was an old tradition to tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve. So it makes sense that this is set Christmas Eve night. They're telling scary stories because that was the tradition. And so that's where the story is coming from. So this is, I think, kind of the setup for the story that's going to be told, for reference. Okay. He turned round to the fire, gave a kick to a log, watched it an instant. Then, as he faced us again, "I can't begin. I shall have to send to town." There was a unanimous groan at this, and much reproach, after which, in his preoccupied way, he explained, "The story's written. It's in a locked drawer. It has not been out for years. I could write to my man and enclose the key. He could send down the packet as he finds it." It was to me in particular that he appeared to propound this, appeared almost to appeal for aid, not to hesitate. Yeah, I think it is an interesting tradition. I don't know how it died out either. It's kind of cool. Which is actually also where Christmas Carol comes from, is from the tradition of telling ghost stories Christmas Eve. So yeah, very Victorian thing, which was written in the same time period as Turn of the Screw. Okay. He had broken a thickness of ice, the formation of many a winter, had his reasons for a long silence. The others resented postponement, but it was just his scruples that charmed me. I adjured him to write by the first post and to agree with us for an early hearing. Then I asked him if the experience in question had been his own. To that his answer was prompt, "Oh, thank God, no." Nothing but the impression I took that here. He tapped his heart. "I've never lost it." "Then your manuscript?" "Is in old faded ink, and in the most beautiful hand." He hung fire again. "A woman's. She has been dead these 20 years. She sent me the pages in question before she died." They were all listening now, and of course there was somebody to be arch, or at any rate to draw the inference. But if he put the inference by without a smile, it was also without irritation. "She was a most charming person, but she was 10 years older than I. She was my sister's governess," he quietly said. "She was the most agreeable woman I've ever known in her position. She'd have been worthy of any whatever. It was long ago, and this episode was long before. I was at Trinity, and I found her at home on my coming down the second summer. I was much there that year. It was a beautiful one. And we had, in her off hours, some strolls and talks in the garden, talks in which she struck me as awfully clever and nice. Oh, yes, don't grin. I liked her extremely, and I'm glad to this day to think she liked me too. If she hadn't, she wouldn't have told me. She had never told anyone. It wasn't simply that she said so, but that I knew she hadn't. I was sure, I could see. You'll easily judge why when you hear." "Because the thing had been such a scare?" He continued to fix me. "You'll easily judge," he repeated. "You will." I fixed him too. "I see. She was in love." He laughed for the first time. "You are acute. Yes, she was in love. That is, she had been. That came out. She couldn't tell her story without its coming out. I saw it, and she saw I saw it, but neither of us spoke of it. I remember the time and the place, the corner of the lawn, the shade of the great beeches, and the long, hot summer afternoon. It wasn't a scene for a shudder, but oh!" He quitted the fire and dropped back into his chair. "You'll receive the packet Thursday morning?" I said. "Probably not till the second post." "Well then, after dinner, you'll all meet me here?" He looked us round again. "Isn't anybody going?" It was almost the tone of hope. "Everybody will stay. I will, and I will," cried the ladies whose departure had been fixed. Mrs. Griffin, however, expressed the need for a little more light. "Who was it she was in love with?" The story will tell," I took upon myself to reply. "Oh, I can't wait for the story." "The story won't tell," said Douglas, "not in any literal, vulgar way." "More's the pity, then. That's the only way I ever understand." "Won't you tell, Douglas?" somebody else also inquired. He sprang to his feet again. Yes, tomorrow. Now I must go to bed. Good night. And quickly catching up a candlestick, he left us slightly bewildered. From our end of the great brown hall, we heard his step on the stair, whereupon Mrs. Griffin spoke. Well, if I don't know who she was in love with, I know who he was. She was 10 years older, said her husband. Raison de plus at that age, but it's rather nice, his long reticence. 40 years, Griffin put in, with this outbreak at last. The outbreak, I returned, will make a tremendous occasion of Thursday night, and everyone so agreed with me that in the light of it we lost all attention for everything else. The last story, however incomplete and like the mere opening of a serial, had been told. We handshook and candlestuck, as somebody said, and went to bed. I knew the next day the letter containing the key had, by the first post, gone off to his London apartments, but in spite of, or perhaps just on account of, the eventual diffusion of this knowledge, we quite let him alone till after dinner, till such an hour of the evening, in fact, as might best accord with the kind of emotion on which our hopes were fixed. Then he became as communicative as we could desire, and indeed gave us his best reason for being so. We had it from him again before the fire in the hall, as we had our mild wonders of the previous night. It appeared that the narrative he had promised to read us really required for a proper intelligence a few words of prologue. Let me say here distinctly, to have done with it, that this narrative, from an exact transcript of my own, made much later, is what I shall presently give. Poor Douglas, before his death, which it was in sight, committed to me the manuscript that reached him on the 3rd of these days, and that, on the same spot, with immense effect, he began to read to our hushed little circle on the night of the 4th. The departing ladies, who had said they would stay, didn't, of course, thank heaven, stay. They departed, in consequence of arrangements made in a rage of curiosity, as they professed, produced by the touches with which he had already worked us up. But that only made his little final auditory more compact and select, kept it round the hearth, subject to a common thrill. The first of these touches conveyed that the written statement took up the tale at a point after it had, in a manner, begun. The fact to be in possession of was therefore that his old friend, the youngest of several daughters of a poor country parson, had at the age of 20, on taking service for the first time in the schoolroom, come up to London in trepidation to answer in person an advertisement that had already placed her in brief correspondence with the advertiser. This person proved, on her presenting herself for judgment at a house in Harley Street that impressed her as vast and imposing, this prospective patron proved a gentleman, a bachelor in the prime of life, such a figure as had never risen, save in a dream or an old novel, before a fluttered, anxious girl out of a Hampshire vicarage. One could easily fix his type. It never happily dies out. He was handsome and bold and pleasant, offhand and gay and kind. He struck her, inevitably, as gallant and splendid. But what took her most of all, and gave her the courage she afterwards showed, was that he put the whole thing to her as a favor, an obligation that he should gratefully incur. She figured him as rich, but as fearfully extravagant, saw him all in the glow of high fashion, good looks, expensive habits, of charming ways with women. He had for his town residence a big house filled with the spoils of travel and the trophies of the chase, but it was to his country home, an old family place in Essex, that he wished her immediately to proceed. He had been left, by the death of his parents in India, guardian to a small nephew and a small niece, children of a younger, a military brother, whom he had lost 2 years before. These children were, by the strangest of chances, for a man in his position, a lone man without the right sort of experience or a grain of patience, very heavy on his hands. It had all been a great worry, and on his own part, doubtless, a series of blunders, but he immensely pitied the poor chicks and had done all he could. This is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, written in the 1800s. For anybody wondering, which is what it says in the title of the live. So it is not under copyright and can be read. He had in particular sent them down to his other house, the proper place for them being, of course, the country, and kept them there from the first with the best people he could find to look after them, parting even with his own servants to wait on them, and going down himself, whenever he might, to see how they were doing. The awkward thing was that they had practically no other relations, and that his own affairs took up all his time. He had put them in possession of Bly, which was healthy and secure, and had placed on the head of their little establishment but below stairs only, an excellent woman, Mrs. Gross, whom he was sure his visitor would like, and who had formerly been maid to his mother. She was now housekeeper, and was also acting for the time as superintendent the little girl, of whom, without children of her own, she was, by good luck, extremely fond. Okay, so this is like the setup of the story that we're going to be told, right? So we're finding out there's a young woman who's 20 who's becoming a governess for the first time. It seems like maybe she's going to fall for the father of the little girl that she's going to be working with, but it's setting him up as like rich and charming and good looking and all of that, right? Like this is kind of setting the stage for this spooky story. All right. There were plenty of people to help, but of course the young lady who should go down as governess would be in supreme authority. She would also have, in holidays, to look after the small boy, who had been for a term at school, young as he was to be sent, but what else could be done, and who, as the holidays were about to begin, would be back from one day to the other. There had been, for the two children at first, a young lady whom they had the misfortune to lose. She had done for them quite beautifully. She was a most respectable person, till her death, the great awkwardness of which had precisely left no alternative but the school for little Miles. Mrs. Gross, since then, in the way of manners and things, had done as she could for Flora, and there were further a cook, a housemaid, a dairywoman, an old pony, an old groom, and an old gardener, all likewise thoroughly respectable. So far had Douglas presented his picture when someone put a question. And what did the former governess die of? Of so much respectability? Our friend's answer was prompt. That will come out. I don't anticipate. Pardon me, I thought that was just what you are doing. In her successor's place, I suggested, I should have wished to learn if the office brought with it necessary danger to life. Douglas completed my thought. She did wish to learn, and she did learn. You shall hear tomorrow what she learnt. Meanwhile, of course, the prospect struck her as slightly grim. She was young, untried, nervous. It was a vision of serious duties and little company, of really great loneliness. She hesitated, took a couple of days to consult and consider, but the salary offered much exceeded her modest measure, and on a second interview she faced the music, she engaged. And Douglas with this made a pause that for the benefit of the company moved me to throw in, the moral of which was, of course, the seduction exercised by the splendid young man. She succumbed to it. He got up, and as he had done the night before, went to the fire, gave a stir to a log with his foot, then stood a moment with his back to us. She saw him only twice. Yes, but that's just the beauty of her passion. A little to my surprise, on this, Douglas turned round to me. It was the beauty of it. There were others, he went on, who hadn't succumbed. He told her frankly all his difficulty, that for several applicants the conditions had been prohibitive. They were somehow simply afraid. It sounded dull, it sounded strange, and all the more so because of his main condition, which was that she should never trouble him, but never, neither appeal, nor complain, nor write about anything, only meet all the questions herself, receive all moneys from his solicitor, take the whole thing over, and let him alone. She promised to do this, and she mentioned to me that when, for a moment, disburdened, delighted, he held her hand, thanking her for the sacrifice, she already felt rewarded. But was that all her reward? One of the ladies asked. She never saw him again. Oh, said the lady, which, as our friend immediately again left us, was the only other word of importance contributed to the subject, till the next night, by the corner of the hearth, in the best chair, he opened the faded red cover of a thin, old-fashioned, gilt-edged album. The whole thing took indeed more nights than one, but on the first occasion, the same lady put another question. What's your title? I haven't one. Oh, I have, I said. But Douglas, without heeding me, had begun to read with a fine clearness that was like a rendering to the ear of the beauty of his author's hand. Yes, the original Insta-love. 100%. So that's the end of like the prologue before part one. And since we've been reading for like 19 minutes, maybe if people like this, I might do more later on. I've got to say it's entertaining. I've never read it before, but it was on my list of things to do, so I thought I would try it here. What do people think? Yeah, intriguing, and it's definitely got some humor in it, you know, poking fun at like, oh, did she immediately fall for him? Is that why she agreed to this very questionable job? The fact that he's also telling her, don't bother me with the kids. I want nothing to do with it. Deal with it yourself. Like, okay. So there you go. Yes, interesting and appropriate to read at night. Well, thank you for joining me. I wanted to test out going live on here. So thanks to those of you who came along. And maybe I will do some more readings from Henry James in the future if people enjoy it. Have a good night, and I'm going to let you all go. Love book narrator. Oh, thank you. It's really fun. You know, I really enjoy doing it, and I thought maybe I would test out doing this because I had some comments on the video I did recently where I read the first chapters of some books for a project with commentary, and a lot of people were like, oh, you should do narration. And so I thought, you know what? Let's see, because maybe if people are into it, maybe I'll do more of it. Okay, I'm going to go, but thank you all for joining me. Have a wonderful night, and see you later.